Alrighty. Good morning, everyone, in person and online. It's lovely to see you all here or virtually. Those of you who I haven't met before, I'm Hutton. I am a National Race Officer and used to work here at the lovely Royal Melbourne Yacht Squadron some years ago, but have been here for about 7 years now, if you can believe it. I can't. It's been a very long time, but it feels like it. So today we're just going to run through some incident management principles from the perspective of a race officer. So hopefully you don't have any incidents like the one pictured, but I did pick an Irish one on purpose. All right. So the things that we're going to cover today are the RO's responsibility for your sailors and your on-water volunteers, some of the elements of safety to prevent or reduce the impact of incidents that might occur, making decisions about whether you're going to start or whether you're going to continue to race, managing an incident if one occurs, and that's going to be fairly limited for reasons that I'll get into in a moment, communication during and immediately after said incident. David Taylor, who's here to my left, is going to provide you with a quick summary of the incident taken seriously, which some of you might be familiar with, and any of the lessons learned out of that. And then we should have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion, so we'll try and moderate that through the online channels as well as in the room and make sure everyone can hear what everyone else is saying. So point number one, big disclaimer. I have a law degree, so I can't help myself, but each club, and even the clubs that we're talking about today and that are in attendance today, has different needs for their safety planning. So that could be because of the classes that are racing, the types of racing you're running, experience levels of volunteers and competitors, geography, weather conditions, all sorts of things that are going to go into that assessment. And that's to ensure the safety of your competitors and your on-water volunteers specifically. So today we're going to cover the principles in broad terms and hopefully just give some ideas for areas for improvement of your planning, but we can't possibly make it exhaustive, and no doubt your clubs have probably very good plans and safety procedures that you follow, so we don't really want to tell you how to suck eggs either. And it's important to note that I'm not an incident management expert or in emergency procedures. I'm not trained in any of those things. I'm trained as a national race officer and as a volunteer. So really, I'm just going to bring you hopefully some ideas today of what world sailing and Australian sailing have as expectations, and about some things that I've noticed over the years in incidents that I've unfortunately had something to do with. So with that said, let's crack on with the RO's responsibilities. So there's a couple of safety rules that competitors are required to follow. Rule one, funnily enough, is about safety. So a boat, competitor or support person should give all possible help to a person and vessel in danger. That's rule number one for a good reason. Rule number three is that the responsibility for a boat's decision to participate in a race or to continue racing is hers alone. So we do give the competitors the responsibility to take care of themselves as much as possible, and also to give other boats around them the impetus that they should be helping out anybody who's in danger. So that's the most important thing to remember, is that the sailors do have a responsibility. However, ROs do have an implied duty of care to their competitors and their on-water volunteers, and that comes via world sailing and Australian sailing, and it's very likely that your specific club safety plan actually gives you a role in that too, a specific duty that says you will be the incident manager or similar. So that's where that comes from, and that's why we are responsible in this circumstance. So from the World Sailing Race Management Manual, a very interesting document if you haven't had a chance of going through all this stuff. There's a heck of a lot there, but basically anything you can think of that might go towards managing races is in there. It's focused on a world sailing level regatta, but it's certainly got some very good best practice stuff in it, so that if you're not really sure how to set up your regatta office, or you're not really sure how to set up a safety plan, all those sorts of things are very useful in here. So this bit, section B5.2, so there's B is really all about safety. Of course, race officer must at all times monitor the fleet and observe the conditions in which they're racing. Priority is always the safety of the sailors, while their boats are of secondary importance. Timing of any intervention is also important. Capsize is a normal part of some types of racing, and an extreme situation others. If the race can continue in safety without intervention, then it should be allowed to do so. Rescue facilities must remain in force until all boats racing or retired are safely back ashore or in a safe haven such as a harbour or marina. So most of that you're going to say, yep, that all makes perfect sense, and we certainly do that with all of our racing that we run. But that's really one of the places where it comes from in terms of the requirements and the responsibility. So some stuff that you're going to have to do to make sure that your racing is safe. And we always think about as race officers, we've got the 3 principles: safe, fair, and fun. And they're in that order. So we think about safety first, then we think about fairness of racing, and then we think about everybody having a nice time. And hopefully you achieve all 3. But the first one being safety. So we're going to think about that before we're even on the water. We're going to deliver safety briefings for on-water volunteers. And there's a big list of the things that you should cover in that World Sailing Race Management Manual, section V6110. Oof, okay. And if there isn't a separate safety officer that's been appointed. So some events, regattas, will actually have a safety officer who is responsible for delivering that briefing and for making sure that all of the setup of the regatta is ready to go and as safe as possible, all the requirements in place. But usually at club level racing, you're not going to have somebody in that position, so it'll be you. You need to understand and implement the club or the organising authority's on-water safety management plan. So, and you may have a club level safety management plan for your usual club racing, but you may have a specific event safety plan. So we'll have a look at a couple of those in a little while. We've got one from AWKR and I've got one from a bit of offshore racing as well in Tasmania to show you. So generally, as we've mentioned, the race officer is going to be the incident controller if an incident occurs, unless and until responsibility is handed over to somebody else. So that might be onshore management, it might be the general manager of the club or the sailing coordinator, or it might be the emergency services such as water police. And unfortunately, as some of you may be aware from previous incidents that have happened around the bay, the race officer may be called upon to give evidence at a coronial hearing if things really go horribly wrong. So that's an extremely unpleasant thing, and I really hope it never happens to any of us, but it does happen. So it's something to think about. So most of you will have seen this risk assessment matrix before. It's pretty common in business and other places where you might have risk. It can be very helpful to you to have a think about the risks that you're likely to encounter in your racing, whatever that may be. And again, it's going to be different depending on your competitors and your type of racing. Just to have a think about the things that might really get into those orange, red and dark red areas. Hopefully none of them are in the dark red areas, that's pretty bad. But you may well end up in some orange areas, and they're things to think about if you can try to mitigate that risk at all. Probably one of the big things is thinking about the type of boat that you've got and how many rescue units you need for them. For instance, we're thinking currently about the 2.4 metre keelboat national championship and how many rescue boats they might need, because they are in danger of swamping if we have interesting conditions out here in Port Phillip. We need to be prepared for the fact that they may swamp, which is a pretty unusual thing for boats on Port Phillip to do, but it does happen. So things to think about. So I'd imagine you can absolutely find this kind of table and risk management framework online. So it can be a very useful thing to think about. So here are some things that no doubt you think about or you have thought about at your club level, but just in case there's a few things that are a little bit lacking, it's worth having a think about them. So we need to have a relevant, up-to-date and practiced safety plan at your club. So often we have a relevant and up-to-date plan, not often we have a practiced one. And that's really common across any kind of contingency planning. I find working in crisis communications is that a lot of the time people have this really good idea of how they're going to handle a crisis on paper, but they've never actually done it. They've never actually put themselves in a situation or a simulation where it has happened and they've had to think through the issues and put themselves under a bit of pressure. So that's often something that gets missed. So again, World Sailing Race Management Manual's got a section of and list of things that you can put in your safety plan if you don't have them already. Again, we've spoken about having a specific safety plan for an event or a regatta, and we'll talk about why that's important when we have a look at those. Having the right people on the water. We know how difficult it is to get volunteers in this day and age, and even finding the right qualified, licensed and experienced people is very difficult, but it is very important. So having the RO being qualified, licensed and experienced, and when I say licensed, I mean boat license and hopefully with a safety boat operator ticket on that as well. So with our mark boats and our safety boats, we want the same. It's no good putting a couple of kids in a safety boat and saying best of luck if they don't know what they're doing. First aid facilities available on the water as well as at the club. I think clubs are tending now towards having defibrillators and more impressive kit out on rescue boats and on committee boats. I think that's a very good thing because unfortunately we do see people having cardiac incidents out on the water. We are an ageing population in sailing, so it does happen. And having that on the shore is probably not going to be good enough to save somebody because it could take 20 minutes or more to get them back. Having a good understanding of the needs of the class and the type of the boat that's racing and of course the skill level of competitors is really important because some days you could have a whole bunch of rock stars out there and you don't need really to support them at all because if they capsize or there's an issue they can fix it. Even if you have a dismasting in a keelboat, sometimes that's not a disaster if everybody knows what they're doing. But you may have a lot of novices out there or people who haven't sailed that specific boat before. Think about AWKR, we've got a really big range of people in that regatta where we've got some, extremely skilled and extremely experienced sailors and we have some brand newbies. So that can be very interesting on the safety front. No doubt everybody's been very familiar with the idea of getting crew lists and contact details. These absolutely 100% need to be up to date and a lot of the time that falls on the skipper of each boat. An example I can think of was there was an offshore race in Tassie that I was familiar with recently where there was some issue of who was actually on board a boat that had an issue, had Mr. Scared, I believe, and they were trying to call various people on mobile and they should have had mobile reception and nobody was answering the phone. They were trying to get hold of a specific person and it turned out that specific person actually hadn't gone sailing with them. They were on the crew list and they weren't actually out there. So that can be pretty scary because you really don't want to ring someone's parent and say, hey, we can't find so-and-so and freak them out when they're actually perfectly safe. That can be very ugly, but in the other way around, we don't want to call people saying that we don't know where so-and-so is and they've been lost. Having a robust sign-on and sign-off procedure. So that is particularly true for dinghies, but certainly for keelboats that can be useful as well. And also for race committee vessels. So we make sure that all of your volunteers get home in one piece as well. This is always a fun one, making decisions about whether to start or continue racing. You're going to get some competitive feedback on this, whatever you do. And that's why it's really good to have, as I know Royal Melbourne does, and probably a bunch of other clubs have, a policy that says at this time of day, if there is a gale warning or if the wind is doing this, then we will cancel. That is the end of it. We'll not have racing today. That can make it really simple because that's the rules and we don't have to have a discussion. However, it is your responsibility as a race officer to make that decision. So the things we're thinking about to make that decision are weather forecasts. And of course, there's a million different places you can get those. The on-course observations, if you're already out there. So if we've got wind readings or we can see the sea state, all those kind of things. As I mentioned, the policy is at club level. So we may say, well, there's a gale warning, so we're not going today. That's fine. Dinghy racing, you tend to have a class wind limit as well. So the classes will say, over 22 knots, we don't race. Happy days. That makes it really easy for us as race officers to say, well, it's 22 knots plus, we can stay home. We need to also think about the safety for volunteers as well as the competitors. One of the examples I think of is Sail Melbourne, or probably the Sailing World Cup at the time, I think it was, 35 knots breeze. So the kiteboards really wanted to race because that's their ideal conditions. They would have a delightful time, but the sea state was such that it wasn't appropriate to have volunteer vessels out there. So unfortunately that didn't really work, but it was something that needed to be considered. It's not just the competitors we're thinking about. So managing an incident. This is a little tricky, as I say, because we're going to be following the procedures in your own on-water safety plan. But let's think about, we're assuming a serious incident is happening here and that requires multiple personnel to be involved in management. So it's not just, somebody gets a bump on the head and the rescue boat goes over. It's more serious than that. So very importantly, we're going to be following whatever emergency procedures you've got in your on-water safety plan. I know the Royal Melbourne one has this, and no doubt others do as well, is having a checklist for your different roles. So in that emergency plan, there's a checklist for the RO that they can say, yep, I've done all of those things, fantastic, and they're in roughly chronological order so that you can do the things that you need to do most importantly first. They also have checklists generally for the safety boat operators and for a scribe as well, and we'll get into that in a moment. We're probably going to think about abandoning or shortening racing if we've got safety issues at hand. We don't really want to be starting more problems, and we want everyone else to be safe. So that's going to be one of the things that you have to think about in among all of the other stuff that's going on for you. And it's really important not to put yourself or your volunteers at risk if it's not safe to assist in an incident. Like anything else, we've got to not add to the casualty list. So there's a few things that can help you. So emergency markers on shore, you should know what they are so that you can get emergency services to there. We've got a couple down here, I think one at the end of the pier and one possibly a bit further down the road so that you can bring people in. If you do get to this situation, and hopefully not that the water police become involved, then they will take over control of the incident. So then the club and the race officer become supporters in that. They provide information and they are a point of contact. We really need to have one point of contact for those people. So probably ideally it would be somebody on shore if you're still out on the water, but make a decision about that, whatever makes sense on the day. Occasionally we get an incident that doesn't involve our people, doesn't involve our competitors or our volunteers, and that can be interesting. Do you have enough resources to go and assist? We really have to go and assist under, various different legislation and our, general moral duty to get things done where we can. But it is something that people probably don't think about too much. And it can happen in some incidents within the sailing community, or it might even be somebody on another watercraft that's having an incident that needs help. Most of you who are familiar with dinghy racing will have seen this done or seen the crew safe tape that we might have. So usually it's a red and white stripey or even a float that can be attached to a boat that's been abandoned. If things have really gone to heck and we've just had to get the people out of there and leave the boat behind, then we mark it so that others can see, right, that boat's been cleared, we haven't lost anybody. So it's really important that you've got some facility to do that on your rescue boats. This is a really big one, communication, and it can be extraordinarily difficult in the event of an incident to keep your communications clear and understood. And I went through a few of the coroner's reports before we did this presentation, and one of the common themes that happens where people have died is the communication has been difficult for some reason or another. So one of the boats where somebody died, their VHF radio was not working. One of the others was we didn't get the message because nobody was listening to that bit of the radio. There's all kinds of things that can go wrong in the communication side of things, and it's you can make your best efforts on the water, but that's a really big one that goes wrong. So keeping a communications log is incredibly important, both for at the time and also for later on. So ideally, we would have somebody as a scribe. So one of your race management volunteers should be appointed to write down everything that comes over the radio, makes a note about what time it happened and what was said. And ideally, you would also have an audio recording. So I have a voice recorder in my kit that I use for starting and finishing, and I would use that. I would just start that to record and just leave it on a desk somewhere so that it can record what's going on, and we've got a record of that. VHF communication, obviously this is the most practical way to get messages out to more than one person. We may use the club channel, or we might use channel 16 if things are really bad. Another thing that came up a lot in those reports is the difficulty of hearing people over VHF if the weather is terrible. So we've got things like wind noise, we've got people, standing out in weather, we've got rain, we've got all sorts of things that can make it difficult for others to hear you on VHF. So that's one of the things that really needs to be clear, that you've got a nice quiet place where you can duck down and at least be heard properly. Mobile phone communication, that's really, really important to have that line open. And most of you, well, obviously everyone will be familiar with 000, but not everyone knows that 112 works on mobile phones pretty much everywhere in the world. Not every country in the world will do it, but overseas it will probably work. So that's just a note that I thought I'd put in because it's interesting. But if we're trying to dial emergency services, with keelboat racing in particular, it is probably better that somebody on board their boat calls 000 or 112 because they've got direct access to the person. If we have dinghy racing, it may be much more appropriate for somebody on a rescue boat to do that. And of course, they're unlikely to be carrying mobile phones on a dinghy. Something that might be useful to consider to keep things clear is using a code word for a serious incident when you're speaking over the radio. So code red is one of the ones they suggest in World Sailing's manual. And that just means everybody knows, right, okay, if a code red is signalled, we know what we have to do. We don't have to go, okay, so what you're going to do is you're going to go here and you're going to over there. We're actually going to know exactly who should do what in that situation. And it just keeps the communications a lot tighter as well, a lot clearer. You should have a list of contacts for the most important people at your club. You should have them stored in your phone so that you can find them quickly. And then you can communicate with, if you've got people in the tower, you've got people on shore, your staff at the club, that sort of thing, you can get onto them straight away without having to dither around and find numbers and all that sort of thing. I know that has happened in the past where it said, oh, we can't get hold of so-and-so because nobody's got their number. Not great. Communicating with emergency services, including water police. Hopefully you don't have to do this again, but they're going to be probably speaking to you on the radio to start with, but they're going to need, as I say, one contact from the club once they've taken over the incident so that we're not playing a game of telephone. Communication with club flag officers. This one I've seen personally go wrong about 10 years ago or nearly 10 years ago, where Commodore of the club was not informed about an incident that had happened and they heard it on the radio, public radio, as in, you know, FM. Like that there is an incident that's happened and, you know, we're following it essentially, and they went, excuse me, that's my club. So that's not cool for various reasons, but also they need to be informed in case they're contacted by the media. And that's sort of the next point down, is that communicating with the media or public. Who's going to do that? Probably the general manager. Sorry, Richard. Or the Commodore, if you can palm it off to the Commodore, that's great. They're going to be the one point of contact. You might decide that you don't want to say anything, and that's totally fine, but there will be, serious incident. It's likely that someone's going to try and contact you, or concerned members of the public. You know, they see 16 ambulances down at the club and they're going to be questioning what's going on. So sometimes nosy people do call in. Sorry, Mon, did you have something to add to that?
Oh, I think I was involved in that incident where the Commodore found out on the radio. So
correct.
Actually, it didn't occur to us to call the Commodore. So
yes.
That was a really good.
And yeah, that's right. It's not necessarily something you think of. I know here now there is in your operations policy and your emergency procedures, there's a communication plan.
Yeah.
And so it says, right, in an incident, these are the people you need to call. Forming a phone tree can be quite useful if anyone's ever had to do that in an incident where you have, you call the first person on the list and then they call somebody and then they call a couple of other people, so that you don't have the responsibility of one person having to call 50 people. But you do absolutely need to let your club flag officers know as soon as possible. Obviously, you need to manage the incident first, but that's going to be a very high priority for you soon enough. And then, of course, we've got the fun of incident reporting. So everyone knows about that form, and it's one of the things that's really important to do after the fact. Dave, do you have something to add? Sorry.
Yeah, when control is handed over to the police, it becomes a police media unit that's the key, correct?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, I'd say probably at that stage you probably don't want to be saying anything because it is then a police matter. And I just say from my work, unrelated to sailing, generally that is fine to just say, look, I'm not the right person to speak to about this. The police media unit will be able to help you. And just be polite and they'll hopefully go away. Doesn't always work, but you can try. So yeah, that's a really big one that I think gets missed a little bit of the time is communication plans, and it's really important. So I'm going to leave you, Mr. David Taylor, now to just have a quick run through an incident that happened how long ago? last year?
4 or 5 months ago,
Yeah, okay.
or 6 months ago.
A little while ago. Let's go with that.
Some time ago.
That's right. And then I'll just quickly take you through some a couple of the event-based safety plans, and I'll show you a couple of things on the Australian Sailing website that's really useful too. Do you want to take the stage, sir?
Give me 2 seconds and I'll just,
I'll ad lib for a moment.
I'll share the correct screen.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah. Let me just stop right then. Sorry. There you go.
So then while you're organising that, have you had a really bad incident you've had to manage?
So the question from the floor is, have I ever had a really bad incident I've had to manage? No, thank goodness. I haven't. And probably the worst thing I've had is a dismasting, which was under control. So that's pretty good. Pretty happy with that. But they do happen. Injury wise, no, not really. There's been a few bumps on the head. A couple of things have happened on the marina, haven't they? So here, where people have injured ankles, that sort of thing, getting out of boats. That's probably been the worst thing that's happened here. Management of shock. I think we probably had the most interesting one, and I wasn't in charge of it, thank God, because I was in the office, was Sail Melbourne or Sailing World Cup when it was here, and we had basically a big whiteout, big breeze, a million optimists coming towards shore at 1,000 miles an hour. Ilka laser at the time that it ended up, God knows how far down the beach. Nobody was quite sure where it had gone. So that was probably the sort of thing where you go, oh, that's not gone very well, has it? Given we've got all the resources in the world here to manage this sort of thing, and yet we've still lost one. He was fine, obviously, but basically we'd lost track of one of the people. So that's something that can happen in big fleets of dinghies. If you get a big wipeout come through, is that you have to do a pretty decent head count, and that can be very tricky when you've got boats all over the place. So this is when our forward planning and looking at weather forecasts is incredibly important. We need to monitor that weather condition all the time. And sometimes we get snuck up on, but certainly we need to do our best to follow it all. All righty. Take it away, Dave.
Okay, thank you, Lou. Look, this will be very, very quick. On Wednesday, the 7th of December last year, we had an incident at the end of a Wednesday afternoon race where one of the... I can't see my face.
Which one is it?
Hang on. It's here.
The camera there.
It's the camera there.
Hold on a second, guys.
I'm short, isn't it?
I can
Just-
duck down a little bit.
Just want to see Dave.
I can control it from there. Okay, so how about that?
Just
I can
stand back
see
a bit.
now.
There we are.
Cool. Oh, sorry about that. You only got the half a talking head. So yes, it was an incident that occurred. I was the race officer on the day. I want to keep this fairly short and just let you know what actually occurred. So basically, the wind and sea state was sort of increasing, etc. As the race went on. We did have a couple of retirements and the like, but in the end, what actually occurred was that a boat, a Nolex 25, was coming in towards the marina. They were trying to get their engine started. They had a small incident where the skipper fell overboard, and he fell overboard, but he was still attached to the boat. He was still actually touching the boat and holding on and being dragged along with it. And they were heading towards the sandy shore up here, just to our north. And I think what's most important about that is that they did actually come safely ashore. That there was it was noted from the tower. We also had another person on a boat out in the marina who was able to see what was going on, and there was quite a bit of work done to just make sure that everything was safe and that they were being looked after. In the end, we actually had a few things that came out of that, including quite a number of recommendations that were made. So what I might do is just quickly skip down to the recommendations at the end of this. Find our way there. So, this was a report that was written up afterwards just to for the benefit of the club, other race officers, and the like, and we can actually provide this to you afterwards as well. If you are interested, please let us know, and we'll provide a copy of this report to you afterwards if you like. So there was quite a series of recommendations that came up at the end there, including, for instance, making sure that we have voice recorders available for the tower and for boats that may be out on the water, etc. as well. So often well-experienced race officers will have their own voice recorders, as of course Lou does, and most others I've seen who have been around the game for a while do too. But also too, there were many final recommendations that came out of it. There were some that were a little bit unusual, and that is things like we didn't actually know who was calling us at one stage there, and it turns out that it was actually the Emergency Response Centre, so the Water Police over at Williamstown. We didn't know what their call sign was. We didn't know who they were. We saw a police boat arriving, and we didn't know the call sign for that police boat as well. So some of those sorts of things now are made available to our race officers so that it's clear cut in the tower that you know exactly who you're talking to and who may actually come on the radio as well. Another thing we did in another more recent incident was we actually actively called Melbourne VTS and called the Water Police when there was a boat that actually had a mast. That was dismasted. The boat was dismasted. They were not actually in the channels at the time, but it turned out they did end up heading towards the channels, and so we made proactive calls in this case to Melbourne VTS and also to the Water Police to make sure that they were aware of what was going on, and to ensure, for instance, that there was no traffic coming out that might cause an issue, and also that if people did call into the Water Police, that the Water Police would already know who was handling it and what was going on. So that's the long and the short of it. I just wanted to quickly raise that one. But another important thing for race officers is to remember that writing up an incident report afterwards will help other race officers in your club and hopefully others elsewhere in other clubs as well. So I think that that's pretty much it for me. As I say, if anybody would like a copy of that, then please let us know and we'll get a copy to you by email. And I'll hand back to Lou for the Q&A.
Thank you. Right. Okay, this one in the share, that'd be good.
The fun with technology.
This one. Alrighty, so just very quickly, I wanted to take you through a couple of places for further resources if this is of interest to you or you want to have a think about it. The first one of those is the Australian Sailing Risk and Incident Management page. And that's got some really good guides, templates for safety management systems and safety management plans. So I'll just see if I can take you to that. So we've got, hopefully you can all see that. So we've got risk and incident management on this page. So you can see there's a whole bunch of things that we need to think about. Duty of care, blah, 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 which we've already talked about. There's a great club safety self-assessment tool on here that you can do to just check in and see if everything's going well or things that you might need to do in the future. There's a whole bunch of risk management resources here as well. So safety management systems, how to create a risk management plan, club safety management guides to preparing one of those, club risk management handbook, a risk register template. So that's something that might come out of your risk assessment. And I believe that's a presentation from the club conference in 2018 about risk management. And then there's some outside stuff as well about workplace health and safety and insurance, which are relevant to clubs as well. Just realised I've actually got this open in another window, so we'll do that. 1 second. Sorry to find all my windows. There we go. Okay.
You're still sharing. Oh,
there we go. Okay, so our major incident reports here as well as another one on the Australian Sailing Resources page. So this is a really unpleasant piece of reading, and if you want to make yourself feel a bit sick, then go through these. But we've got a whole bunch of reports that have happened out of different events and that have been reported up to Australian Sailing. You'll see there's probably more in the previous years or the more recent years, but we do go all the way down to Sydney and Hobart 98 and Big Bay Race from Melbourne that you guys will be familiar with, Excalibur and Association Cup in 2004. So all of those are on there for lessons learned and can be very unpleasant reading, but useful to learn some things as well. There's, as you'll see, some stuff around, as far as the fast net away, but also things that are much more local than that. So that can be a fun one. Just while we're here, there's also the the race management manual that I've been talking about throughout. So section V is the safety management section there. So you can see there's a whole bunch of things there. There's about risk assessments, there's crisis management plans, event types. So the types of event that you're going to have, how that makes things different for you, who's responsible for what, how you're going to deal with competitors, and some safety planning stuff there as well. So that's all quite handy business as well. Let me get back to my PowerPoint now. Stop that. Not really. I think I've closed it. That's all right. Start that again. It's gonna let me. I'm gonna do it the hard way. Okay.
Okay. Oops.
Go. Okay. All right, so that's those two links, and they're very useful. If anyone would like it, I can probably paste them in the chat if we can. So I'll try and do that as well. Oh, that's right. I was going to show you, before we get to questions and whatnot, I was going to show you the incident management plans, wasn't I? So there we go. That's what I want. Okay, so most of you are familiar with the Australian Women's Keelboat Regatta as a concept, but basically it's a little bit of a different situation to what you might have in your normal club racing, because we have boats that are borrowed by others and not terribly familiar with them, often a new skipper as to the usual thing. We've got new crews. We might have people who are coming from interstate and aren't familiar with the conditions that we have here at Port Phillip. For example, people coming from Darwin without adequate gear, that's always fun. And of course, it is a bit of a high-profile event. So, if anything does go really to custard, then it's probably going to be known about on at least the sailing channels, if not the other ones. So this basically is an addition to the club's incident management policies and procedures. So again, we've got the RO being in charge of the incident management. So they're going to be the incident management controller. And then that might, of course, flow onto emergency services a bit later on. We're going to have a team of people that are going to be helping that out. We're going to inform flag officers. We will have a media liaison. So the Commodore's just walked in, I think. So he's going to be the sole point of media contact. Yeah, that's right, bad luck. You have to anyway. I'm sure you can delegate. It's fine. We're going to have shore-based support. We're going to be prepared for this before the event, so it's not going to be one of those things where we go, oh, we've got a problem, we're going to need to think about it now. We're going to have all of those regatta-specific emergency contacts who might be different to your usual contacts. For example, I'm not normally here, but I'm here for AWKR, so people need my number for this one. We're going to have a list of emergency contacts for everybody in case there are any issues, and we're going to have a list of crews so we know who's who in the zoo. And we're going to need to think about all of these things in terms of activities during the event, and we're going to log all the incidents. So that's a pretty simple one. What is it, 3 pages? Not too difficult to come up with. A lot of it's going to come out of your usual incident management stuff. And then we've got a slightly more complicated one here, which I have stolen from Taswegia. So we have the Bruny Island race, some of you might be familiar with this. It obviously has been going 96 years now. And it is essentially an offshore race. So you'll see this one's much longer. It's 20 pages because there's a heck of a lot more stuff that you need to deal with. It's not in the usual range of conditions. So we'll just have a look at the table of contents so you can see what's in there. So we've got how we're going to organise our emergency management team, how we're going to define different types of emergencies. And that's kind of what I'm saying about having the code word. So if you've got a serious incident on the water and it's a code red, these are going to trigger different responses. So a minor incident, you might have one rescue boat that goes, oh, that person's, we've got a broken rib on board a boat. Well, they're actually fine. They can keep sailing. They're not happy about it, but they can keep sailing. That's all fine. We might have major incidents where, there's one boat that's had a really bad time. We might have a serious incident where we've got loss of life or the threat of it. So we've got basically how do we figure out when we've got one of these emergencies and who needs to know what's going on. We've got our race emergency management centre, how we're going to stand that up and have it ready to go. These are the procedures if we do have these problems. So we've got terrible weather, we've got damaged yachts, we've got injuries, we've got an MOB, boat sinking, maydays or EPIRBs going off, and we have potential loss of life as an option as well. And then as we talk about communications, it tends to go kind of down the list a little bit, the communications, but it is really important. And then we've got some bits and pieces in there, but you'll see it does go on quite a bit. We might just go to the bit that talks about how we define emergencies, because I think that's quite interesting. So a minor incident is boat damage or dismasting, or a pan or a medical call. So essentially race control thinks about how bad that is going to be and responds accordingly. We've got major damage, we've got potential severe weather or potential severe incident or an MOB or a serious injury, then we're going to need to start letting people know. And you'll see the water police come in when we've got potential for serious injury or man overboard. Serious incidents, we're talking about loss of life, really severe weather. Somebody's in the water more than 10 minutes. So that's not a very long time, but it's certainly been long enough, I believe, in this race for someone to pass away. And if we've got maydays, obviously that's pretty serious business too, and we want to talk to the water police if they're not already hearing it. So that one obviously is much more complicated because you are going to have people offshore. You don't have the ability to control what's going on once they're out past a certain point. A lot of it is going to have to be done by radio and by mobile phone, which is tricky and needs lots of thinking about. Alrighty, so questions, discussion. So we'll try and moderate this the best we can. I can open the chat here as well. So if anyone's got any questions that they want to ask in the room or over your speaker, please feel free to unmute yourself if you're online and go for it. We can put stuff in the chat. So if you've got a question that you don't really want to ask verbally, but you can put it in the chat, we can certainly answer it that way. Richard, I'll relay as well as people come here. Yeah.
All of this is assumed that everything is happening in a ordered fashion.
Yes.
Murphy's Law will have an incident occurring, for instance, as you are the race officer and then become the incident controller, right in the start sequence. How do we deal with the delegation out and not getting drawn into something that can be managed by other people or a delegated person?
Yeah. So the question being, if we've got, say, a minor incident, would you say, rather than a major one?
An incident.
Okay. So if I've got a major incident or anything that I think is likely to be a major incident in a start sequence, I'm going to postpone that. I'm going to figure that everybody else can just wait a few minutes while I get my act together if we think it's something serious. If we've got a minor incident where, we get a call from a radio saying, oh, we've got a problem, we've got, we're trying to get home, but we've got a, rope wrapped around the prop or something like that, and we're drifting towards shore. If there's something that can be done by a rescue boat, great. Then we can manage that over the radio. One of the things that we do in the Australian Women's Keelboat Regatta that works really well is we have a separate channel for the boat boys. So the folks who are helping out with fix-its and rescue, to some capability are on a different channel for the race management. And that can make it a lot easier because then that management goes over there. If I don't have to be the incident manager at this point, if we're talking about something that's not too serious, then I'd be more than happy to just farm that off to them and let them deal with that issue, with a minor injury, illness, something that can be taken care of by somebody else. If we're talking about something serious, I'm absolutely going to postpone racing until I figure it out. I figure that doesn't matter. You know, people are just flapping about for a few more minutes. That's no problem. But yes, you're right. It does happen that way. Things will happen all at once. You might have, I think at one stage in AWKR, we might have had 2 separate S80s throw people overboard, which was exciting. They were fine, but it meant that we had then 2 rescue boats at 2 separate points dealing with 2 separate things. And that could be quite interesting, because then if you have a third thing and you've only got 2 rescue boats, what do you do? And generally when we talk about this, and interestingly with the race officer qualifications that we get and the presentation that I deliver and others deliver through Australian Sailing, we talk about safety, of course we do. We don't talk about managing incidents. That's not a thing that comes up in that presentation. It's one of the things we've had to learn kind of separately, which is interesting. And I think it's probably something that needs to be thought about. But at the moment, you're taught about, you know, if you're concerned about safety, call off racing. That's one of the things you can do. In the rule book, it says abandon or postpone if things are going to hell. Failure is no problem at all. And so that's probably the thing that I think about then, is going, well, is it really worth it? Hope that answers your question. Bit of a ramble. Yeah, in the room. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, rescue boat courses. Is there a separate course held for that? And where would I find that?
Yeah, so there's a thing called the Safety Boat Operator Certificate. So you get your boat license and then you can do that on top of it. It used to be called a TL3, I think was the reference.
Yeah.
That's very good, and that does help you with things like people overboard, so the right procedures to come alongside and pick them up.
Yep.
Practice is the best thing. So if it's possible, I know here you guys run an MOB drill for the competitors, right? Does that still happen each year? Yeah. So if you don't do that already, I think it's a really good idea to have a rescue boat do similar things on the same day or a different day, so that you're used to picking people up. And the challenges are, and things that you read in the coroner's report doesn't necessarily mean it was the cause of the person losing their life, but a lot of the rescue boats we have here are really marked boats. You know, they've got high sides, they don't have any way to drag a person who's unconscious or very unwell or very injured on board a boat safely. Ribs are much better for that as a general rule. Lots of keelboat clubs don't really use ribs. So that's one of the things that we've got to think about, is if somebody actually has a nasty accident on board and is in the water and they're injured or they're unconscious, how are we actually going to deal with that? And that can be a really tricky one. So having a practice run of that, I think, is a good thing to do once a year, just to make sure everyone feels comfortable with doing that. It's a bit like doing your first aid training, isn't it? But yeah, that's probably the best way to go. I'm not familiar with any other specific courses for that sort of thing, but certainly practice makes perfect. Has anyone else got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I did the TL 3 years ago, but because I was in an off beach club at Hampton, I did a lot of on-board practice, so it was plus the practical really helped.
Yeah.
So now I know how to go up, and then 2 people in a rescue boat, there's practice that was helped. But the TL 3, well, now the safety boat operator, you can put it on as a one-off if you want to. So if you get enough people to go, hey Richard, can we have the course? Do it. So if there's enough numbers, it's worth doing it. If you you already have the powerboat?
Yeah, I got the powerboat. I just said it'd be good.
Yeah, so I think if people just reach out and go, yeah, let's put on the safety boat one and do practical.
Yeah.
Years ago they did it 2 in 1.
Yeah. So just to translate, sorry, we're just talking about whether it's worthwhile having a club event where we all do, or everybody does a safety boat operator course at once. And I think that's a really good idea if you haven't done it. Nice. You on from the floor? We got any questions from online? I can only see a few of you.
We want them not to get coffee.
That's right. You've wandered off. Fair enough. It's early. Are there any comments, observations? Has anyone learned anything from an incident that they would like to share that might be useful to others at other clubs or other areas?
Well, I've got a story. This is the
Come on down so they can hear you.
I've got the story.
Ron's coming down. So I'll get to Hobos in just a sec.
There she is. All right, so about 10 years ago, maybe, we were doing some racing on Sunday, the office wasn't open. We were racing and we got T-boned. And issues with the radio, they couldn't hear that we had severe problems. We're heading for shore. Actually, we got T-boned. First thing we said was, we said to our bow person, Dee, can you stick your head over and describe it? And she said, we've been holed. And I said, how big? She said, bigger than my head, smaller than my bum. We're going home. So we're trying to go, and it was a bit frivolous, really. We were taking on water. So we tried to get off the race officers. They can't hear us. We're muffled. They couldn't hear it. So we switched to 16 as we're going into the water. And it meant that the Metropolitan Fire Brigade boat came over to help us. By this stage, we got picked up by our club on a rescue boat. Metropolitan Fire Brigade boat said to us, can half of you jump back in the water and go into our boat because you're overloaded? No. So
I believe the response to that from the race, the person managing that rescue boat was, can't be printed. Put it that way.
Yeah, that's right. So we got to shore and the ambulance got called. We all got checked. We're all fine. Because it went on to 16, the media heard about it and they all camped outside the club. So it didn't occur to us to tell the Commodore that there was issues. So we learned that perhaps we should have. It went on the media. The next day at work, I became the lead story on a couple of TV channels. So it was suboptimal. Anyway, right, so I go to work the next day and I go get a coffee. I work in IT. The first question was some random lady going, who were the bloody idiots out in the water yesterday? A little bit of risk management around that. So we learned a lot about that, but include tell the Commodore. So we learned a lot of lessons from that one. So I just want to give you an idea of what actually happened. And, we've all got a bit of trauma. Subsequently, we decided to have staff on a Sundays just in case things like that happen again. So we had a lot of lessons learned. Anyway, interesting. So, carry on back to you.
Thanks, Mon. Yes, I was semi-involved in that one, being assistant manager at the time. So I got the phone call because the general manager lives much further away than I did, and we had a bit of a bun fight on our hands by the time we got down here. Luckily, as Mon says, everybody was safe, but lots of gear lost, lots of phones drowned, I think, that sort of thing. Keys, yeah, all those kind of things. So very unfortunate incident, and very weird to be able to see, because of course it's not all that deep out here just off Royal Melbourne. Be able to see the top of the sail sticking out still, and not much else. So it was a little bit ugly. So it can be very interesting, and when the world at large gets involved, it can get quite interesting, as Mon suggests. I didn't know you were on the telly. That's quite exciting.
The boat that T-boned you, did they stop to help?
No, they actually, a bit more of a story on that one. Actually, all right.
Sorry, Mon's got
So a bit more of the story. So
I'll answer some chat
in
questions.
that competition, you weren't allowed to sail on your own boat. You had to be on another Adams 10. So to make it more complicated, we're on a borrowed boat. We're on Cirrus Yahoo. Guess which boat T-boned my boat? The boat I'm on. Salamander here's the boat I'm on. So they're all thinking Cirrus Yahoo from Brighton are all 7 sunken sailors on the news. Wasn't them, it was us. Anyway, so my brother's watching the news going, hang on, this looks familiar. But they lost their foresight. So they had their own crisis. So they were managing themselves. I don't think they realised we were heading off home to try and save ourselves. So they were unaware. So anyway, it got complicated.
It sure did.
Listening to George Channel?
It sure did. And that's again why it's really good to have one of those incident specific safety plans, because if we're talking about, in this case, we're talking about Adams 10s, which are largely similar, but you may be borrowing boats that are not similar to what you normally sail, and people are not totally aware of how to get these things happening. Now, Horrors crew, did you have something you wanted to add?
That's you. All right. Hobson's Bay here. Good presentation. Seems to be focusing mostly on sort of procedures and communication. Just had a question about boat safety audits.
Mm-hmm.
We have an annual audit to make sure everyone complies with Cat 6 and so on. Would you have any comments about that? Is that effective? Should it be more rigorous?
If you're doing audits, I think that's wonderful, because under the scheme, essentially a skipper can tick all the boxes and submit the form and say, yep, that's all done, and it can be absolute bollocks. They haven't done none of it. So I think if you are doing a yearly audit on boats. I think that's a really good idea. I don't know if all clubs do that. I'm looking around going, yes, getting lots of nods here, good-o. Yeah, I think that's a really useful thing to do, and to involve the skipper and the crew. They understand the importance of having these things on board. Obviously, if you're doing, say, a yearly audit, that doesn't stop them from taking stuff off and leaving it on the marina. But having the threat of a spot audit is probably not a bad plan. So you might say somewhere in your club sailing instructions, or we certainly do that for things like AWKR, we say, well, at any time a qualified person might come along and just check out your boat. I believe that was being done here at one stage, where boats were being just randomly targeted. I think that's probably not a bad thing to at least have as an idea, so that people are not tempted to go, oh, that's annoying having that thing on board, we'll just leave it here.
It's been more of an issue where you've got boats that might race Cat 2, and they then take all the stuff off as far as Cat 2.
Yeah.
But then they're not actually technically Cat anything.
Right, yes.
So what we've said is get a Cat 2 and a Cat 6
Yes.
declaration, have 2, so you can actually then comply with the lower.
You have a
program 6.
good idea. Yeah, so Jason's just saying there, it's a good idea to have, for your racing boats, if they do race, say, Cat 2 events, to actually also have a Cat 6 certificate ready to go, so that you don't, if you take all your Cat 2 gear off, you actually are still certified to race under the club racing or whatever level you might be doing. I hadn't thought about that, but that's messy, isn't it? Just to quickly answer the questions in the chat while we're here, I can absolutely send you my presentation. That is no problem at all. I'm not quite sure how I can distribute that, but I'll send it on to Anne. Is that okay? Here, and then you can distribute it through the various channels. Don't think, actually, if it's not too big, I can post it in the chat as well. I'll see if I can do that. Ian asks, how or where does one obtain RO qualifications? That is a really good question. That's a pretty fundamental question. I'm glad you asked it. So Australian Sailing run pretty regular qualifications now for regional level and for national level, and it's the same course. So if you want to be either of those things, you attend a 2-day course with somebody like me, bless you, and usually one other presenter, because it's a bit of work to get through. And we run you through pretty much everything from the study of the rules through to, preparing your crew and your boat for racing, briefing competitors, setting up start lines and courses, running start sequences, monitoring sailing, and then doing finishes and tidy up. That's pretty much how it all goes, and we dive into a few different little areas as well about different rules and whatnot. So the best place to find out about that is on the Australian Sailing website. It'll be under, let me just go and have a look, because I'm not sure now.
Lou, what is the latest on the RO?
You're going to ask me about Club RO, aren't you?
And the changes.
So let me just find this, and I will come back to that.
Dodge, handball.
No, I'm not going to dodge it. Well, I am a little bit, because I don't know the answer, but I can tell you what I know.
That's all right. No, if
that's all right.
Confusing if it's a bit like.
There we go. Okay, so it's on the Sailing Resources website, which is Australian Sailing's website. Sorry, you guys online won't be able to see this. Let me share it. That one. So it lives here. So there's Sailing Resources, and then you just click on Officials up the top, and there's the accreditation and reaccreditation. So there's lots of different options. There's heaps of stuff to be read, all very exciting. In terms of actually getting onto a course, let's have a look at where we might find one of those. There we go, Officials courses. So we scroll down. If you want to be a judge or a measurer, that's all fine, but race officers are what we're thinking about. So we've got regional and national level course. So that is the serious business course, where generally we want you to have run some racing and probably be running them pretty regularly at your club at the very least. It does assume a bit of knowledge in terms of running racing, because it is supposed to be a high level qualification. If that is not your bag, or you haven't got to that stage as yet, we have this very excellent online course, which is free and takes a couple of hours maybe, called the Committee and Finish Boat online course. So essentially that you can do at any time at your own pace, and it covers a lot of the stuff about being on a start boat or a finish boat. lots of the procedures and bits and pieces that you might feel like you want to do. There's also a really good mark layer online course. So that'll tell you basically what we're doing in terms of, you know, how to lay marks successfully, and give you a bit of a quiz on that. There's no substitute for experience when laying marks, of course, because we've all got to at least wrap it around the prop a couple of times before we get good at this stuff. But that is a good start if you haven't done something like that before. So we've actually run quite a number of the regional and national level courses over the last few months. It tends to be a bit of winter activity because people are not racing and they can spare a weekend. But I believe there is another one coming up. Let's have a look, shall we? Melbourne. See if I can find one. There you go. So there's an October one, 28th of October and 29th of October. So that'll be the next one, and that's at the boat shed. So very convenient for most people, I hope, at Albert Park. I know that's within the sailing season, but that might be the next best option for anyone who's interested in doing that. To get back to your question, Spina, about what's going on with the race officer qualifications, you may be familiar with the concept that the club RO qualification has now been discontinued. There are a number of reasons for that, and I can't really go into all of them, but the short version is essentially that any old person could get a club race officer qualification. If you logged into the online version that we were delivering through COVID and afterwards, turned your camera off and went and made a cup of tea and came back 3 hours later, you're a club race officer. Because we had absolutely no way of telling whether you'd been paying attention or that you'd even been there, other than the fact that your screen was registered as appearing. Similarly, if we were doing them in person, there wasn't really a way of testing people's knowledge within that program. So you could sit there for 3 or 4 hours and listen to one of us drivel on and be absolutely none the wiser by the end of it, and still be a club race officer. And that implies some duty of care. It implies some duty of responsibility, that you know what you're doing. And my understanding was that Australian Sailing just saw that as too much of a risk, that you'd have people running racing who were really not up to it. And we had, I think, about 1,500 club race officers in Victoria. How many people do you reckon actually run racing in Victoria on a regular basis? It's going to be, in the whole of Victoria, it's going to be probably 100 max. So there's a whole bunch of people out there who and fair enough, they did the course because they wanted to learn more about sailing, about, you know, being a better sailor. And it really was quite useful for that, to understand what the race officer's thinking about and the procedures and the flags that they use. It's all very useful for that. But that's what that online course will now cover. It'll tell you about how to, you know, what flags go up when and what to do and how to run a timing sequence and all those kind of interesting things. So it still helps you as a sailor if you don't really have that much interest in race management, but you want to know what's going on. It still can be quite a useful course. I know that's been a little bit of a change for people that they haven't necessarily been happy with. There's people who only ever run racing at club level and are very happy doing that and are very good at doing that, but they don't want to progress. They don't want to be a regional race officer, but that's now unfortunately the requirement. Generally, if you are running racing regularly, you will be able to pass the exam at regional level. That's my feeling on it, having done a few of these now. So it is a pretty big commitment, and you know, one of the things that we talk about in sailing a lot is the volunteer levels, that we require a lot of responsibility from our people, but that is the way it is. So something to think about.
Is it only online?
So the course, the committee Finnish boat course on here is only online. I am aware that there are options for clubs to kind of have their own session. There's no qualification attached to it, but if you wanted to have somebody qualified come along and say, this is the best procedure for race officers, or these are the sorts of things we're thinking about, that's doable. It's just not an Australian Sailing qualification, but you do get a qualification out of the online version. So it'll give you a tick to say you've done that course and that you are qualified to run low-level racing, essentially.
So what about someone like me who did an intensive course back in 2007?
Yeah.
And covered all those things. It was 6 weeks.
Gosh, okay.
Well, it was 6 weeks at night, you know, couple of,
Yeah.
and it covered powerboat thing.
Perfect, that sounds great.
whatever.
Yeah.
But, so what happens with that? Because I have done that.
So at some point you do need to reaccredit. So
I've reaccredited every,
yeah,
what
if
is
you've
it,
done it every
3
4
years,
years, yeah,
4
it
years.
expires every 4 years your qualification. So that is now, well, it has been for a while, is an events-based situation. So basically you have to have done sufficient events at the right level, and those have changed a bit in the new.
and so that
officiating
wouldn't be
program.
a tower club.
Well, it could be for
Just to interrupt you, so I've been having discussions with Megan.
Yeah.
And it's sadly, it's just way too slow.
Yeah.
But they recognise that they've kind of messed it up.
Yeah.
And they're still trying to work on what they want to do. But the latest is that their plan is to just go, you're already qualified, you're doing it, it's fine.
Yeah. And I think that's,
yeah,
I think that's the thing. I think it's always going to be the sense of, well, and it's, you know, it's really up to the club to go, well, we trust you. We know that you can do what you need to do. We're not going to make you go and do a 2-day course just to prove that you can do what you can do.
Okay.
And it's too high level for
Yeah.
what we're doing, just basically off the rocks.
That's right. And so that's always going to be the challenge. And I think it's, to be perfectly honest, it's Australian sailing, I think, thinking about Sydney.
Yeah.
And Sydney has lots of clubs and they have lots of rock stars, and that's all fun. They also have their, you know, fun off the beach clubs, all that kind of thing as well, but they're not necessarily thinking about the folks who are just needing to run club racing all the time. And I think there's a little gap in between what's provided online and what people are actually doing. We do, of course, want people to be regional race officers and be qualified if they would like to be. And I think there's also, with some of the folks, they are struggling a little bit with the loss of a title. So they've been a club race officer for quite a long time, although I think that qualification only existed for about 8 years. But they have a bit of a status in that. You go, well, I've got a badge basically, and that's gone. And I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
Because people do feel connected to that, but they also don't want to spend a lot of time and effort to do it. I think at this stage you actually have to pay for yourself too, which is a bit interesting. But anyway, Dave.
I think one thing that's important to point out too is that part of the reason of having today's session, right, is to try and give race officers at our club and hopefully those others who are listening in as well, something that maybe they don't get out of some of the, or have never got out of some of the basic race officer qualifications, etc. So I hope that we'll be continuing to do something like this on an annual basis, not necessarily exactly this, but something new each year for race officers to ensure that our club race officers, get the support that they need and the additional information that they may need.
Absolutely. And there is a requirement as well, if you are qualified, to have a little bit of professional development, to have attended some kind of seminar. This one doesn't count, sorry. But something like Sail Melbourne, so that's happening in the last week of November, early December this year at Brighton. That has a sailing, a race officer seminar in that. So attending that can be very helpful as well, because there's lots of things that come up in that. Sometimes it's around safety management. Last year we talked about Boyzone, the app, which is really brilliant. Predict Wind came along and taught us a few things. They talk about management of offshore racing and some other interesting stuff that we don't have time for today, or really the scope for. So if you can attend those kind of things, that's really useful as well, just to get a bit of a top up of knowledge and just meet a few people and get some different perspectives. I've always found that very useful to see what's going on in the world. Yeah, I suppose that really covers it. There is some, yeah, as you say, some discussion about what's going to happen with all of that. But at the moment, I think probably what you're doing is probably fine. If you are a club race officer and you go for a few more years, then you don't have to worry about it. A lot of those, that time was extended during COVID as well, of course. But I think the events are going to be where people get tripped up, like what level of event you need to have to be qualified. Just because we have so many race officers in Victoria as well who are active, the events at the higher level in particular are pretty hard to come by and not necessarily enough to go around. So that's going to be interesting. Anne?
At what stage do you give the water police the authority to make a call to, take their direction?
They'll give it to you. They'll say where it's going. Yeah, so the question was, when does the water police take over? When they say so is probably the answer to that.
2 years ago, matrix ended up on the beach.
Uh-huh.
And I did panhandle.
Mhm.
The water police were bang on it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're bored. They have
And-
very little to do a
yeah,
lot of the
yeah,
time, and so
yeah.
they're a bit like the fireys. They're
And-
kind of all
and-
sitting around
and-
playing cards, and
Yeah,
they want
the
to do
first-
stuff.
Yeah,
So
the first
yeah.
thing they said to me, give me your mobile phone number.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. So that's the thing. So if you get they'll be straight onto it. They're generally pretty responsive because like I say, they're probably, especially at this end of the bay where not a great deal happens probably. Then it can be very quick. So and that's probably important to remember as well, is that they're the bosses. Once they're here, they're in charge, and we just help them. And as you say, Amanda, you might give them your mobile number so that they've got that one point of contact. If they've got questions, generally the situation in front of them is going to be pretty obvious, hopefully, and they can figure out what to do next. But as Mon said, sometimes you get them to come along and say, oh no, you need to unload that boat, it's overloaded. And you go, think about that from a safety perspective for 1 second. Are we going to put cold? This is winter, right? It was July, I seem to remember.
Yes.
Yeah, it was freaking cold in the water, right? So we're not going to unload people back into the water. That's just nuts. So sometimes they have a little bit of an unrealistic expectation, but generally I think the water police are pretty sensible.
With each other.
Right.
Hello, Hobbo's team. What do you got for us?
Right. In terms of incident management, we had a recent MOB situation where the MOB decided to wave off the first boat that arrived because they wanted to get back on the boat they fell off. I think as a standing order, we should have something in place to say the first boat that attends to an MOB, especially in winter, is the boat that you get on when safe to do so.
100%. I agree entirely. Yeah, no. Yeah, it's like the old joke, isn't it? God sends the helicopter to someone. He's like, no, I'm waiting for God to save me. It's that kind of stupid thing. So yeah, absolutely, I agree entirely. It should be the requirement, and often it'll say something in your sailing instructions that says the sailors shall take the direction of rescue boats or official boats. So basically, if a rescue boat comes along and says, I'm going to help you because you need it, you can't say, no, I'm right, thanks, I'll swim to shore, or whatever you think. The question is, and you need to listen to the people on the rescue boat. So yeah, having something that says basically the first boat to come along to help you needs to be the one to help you. I think that's great. And the thing is, that's why we have things like redress. We can fix this later on if somebody's MOB and another boat loses time fixing that, then we can fix that up. That's not a big deal at all.
Have not the rules changed in relation to that as well, in that getting help in a situation like that doesn't automatically mean that you're that you're disqualified?
That is a good question. I need to read the wording again, but basically we're talking about rule number 1 again, aren't we? We're saying, well, you will help somebody who's in danger, and being in the water by yourself is in danger, I figure. So any boat needs to come along and help you, and you need to, it doesn't really say you need to accept that help, but I think it's a very good idea to have that somewhere.
Yep.
See if I can figure out how to share this presentation with you guys as well.
I much prefer presentations than online courses.
Oh yeah, most people do. That's fair. Yeah.
I just find the online stuff and,
Yeah. Look, we're all sick of Zoom. I get that. Sorry, everyone. But yeah, that's what I'm finding in our training business is that even if people have got colleagues who are all over Australia, they'd rather spend the money on the flights than do an online course, which I just find really fascinating. But yeah, it's pretty normal at the minute. All right. I don't think I've got the facility to. Oh yeah, hang on. Yes, I do. Let's see if I can share this with you guys before we go anywhere, because that'll be the easiest way for you to download it. There you go. Okay, so the presentation's in the chat there if you want to download it. I'll also send it through to Anne so that she can distribute if anyone's not able to get it right now. I know you guys are in a big group at Hobbos in particular, but if you want to download it from there, you're most welcome. If anyone has any questions that you need answering, probably best to email me. I'll put my email in the chat as well. That's the presentation just coming through. And if, like, just on another note, if you've got questions about race officering in general, or how to get qualified, or any of those things, if you need assessments done to get your regional or your national, then that's something we can definitely talk about. I'm on the Victorian Race Officials Committee for my sins as well, so we bring up those kind of issues all the time. So if there's anything that you want to raise there, then go for it. Send me an email. Any more from the floor or from the onlines? We good? Awesome. All right. Well, thank you everybody for attending today. It's been really nice to see all of you from various places. And hopefully it brings us to another good season. I know we're getting pretty close to that now, and I'll hope to see you guys on the water at some point in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone online, just on behalf of RMYS, thank you so much for coming along, and we really appreciate your time and efforts, and it's been great having you here, and hopefully we'll see you again. Okay, cheers. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Well done.